akachukua chakula akampatia. Akashika akaangalia Susan. Sahani kaanguka chini kapasuka. Nimekuambia nipe pini ya M-Pesa. Huyo akasema sitakupatia pini. Leo utanijua, nipe simu ya M-Pesa, akasema nitakupa.
Some crimes don't erupt in chaos. They don't come from the shadows of strangers in the night. They are born inside the home near the people we trust. They occur inside the walls that should protect us, where love once lived and where trust is meant to hold. But sometimes, the home becomes the most dangerous place of all. In August of 2025 in Nairobi's sprawling pipeline estate, a young woman's life was stolen. Her name was Susan Nabwire, a 27-year-old mother. Susan was a businesswoman and someone who spent her days working hard to give her little girl a future. The man who ended her life was no stranger. He wasn't a thief breaking in or a passing killer. He was her husband and a former police officer. A man who once swore to protect would be the one to end it all. On that fateful night, the 1-year-old child was only a few feet away with the family's house help inside the house. And in a moment that should never have been possible, their home turned into a prison of terror. This wasn't just violence, it was control, rage, and premeditation. The occurrences of that night had been planned in the silence of a man's mind. By the time the night was over, Susan was gone. The house help was violated, and the child's innocence was marked forever. This is not just a murder story. It's a story of obsession and betrayal. It's a story about how a darkness chose to strike from within. This is Dark Our Dogs, and this is the sad, terrifying story of the night in Pipeline Estate where Susan Nabwire fell. Before the horror of that night swept through her rented home in Kware, Susan Nabwire lived a life defined by commitment, subtle strength, and love. She was just 27 years old. By day, she stood behind the counter of an M-Pesa kiosk inside Machakos Country Bus in Nairobi. A small business in a vast city, but one of tremendous importance. For her customers, she wasn't simply making deposit or withdrawals. She was trust itself. She handled hard-earned income, relief funds, and essential transfers. In a city where convenience means survival, she was a trusted lifeline. To her family, Susan was a pillar of warmth and a quiet determination. She didn't command attention with grand gestures, she earned it with steady, consistent love. Every morning, she woke up and did what needed doing. She cared for her child, managed her business, answered her phone, and paid her rent. She carried the weight of daily life with grace. Above everything else, she was a mother. Her 1-year-old daughter was her greatest joy. Even in the cramped, congested corridors of Pipeline Estate, her child's laughter echoed through the walls. It was bright, unfiltered, and hopeful. That laughter was Susan's anchor, the living symbol of every sacrifice she made. Susan's life wasn't glamorous. She wasn't known or wealthy, but she was steady and dependable. She was working, step by laborious step, towards a better life for her child. Yet, even as she built that life, shadows gathered at its edges. Her husband, 44-year-old Cyprian Mukoye, had once served in the police. But by 2025, that service was behind him. His job was gone and he drifted into casual labor in the same Pipeline neighborhood. So Mukoye's uniform had been removed, but not the weight he carried with it. Neighbors had seen the tension long before that fateful night. The couple used to have quiet arguments, both physically and over the phone. This involved disagreements over late hours and her independence. There were whispers of jealousy and her strength made him suspicious. Mukoye began demanding access to her passwords and her M-Pesa PIN. These were tools of control, with the intention being to tether and to overpower. But Susan stayed with him, first for her child and also for the home they shared. Maybe she stayed because she held on to the hope that he could still change. Unfortunately, she never knew how wrong that hope was. Her story is a stern reminder of a devastating, brutal truth that the victims of domestic violence are not nameless. They are people like Susan. These are mothers, workers, and women trying to survive. And for Susan, survival slipped away on a single night. A night where everything safe turned deadly. August 13, 2025 was a night like any other in Kware in Nairobi's Pipeline Estate. Outside, the estate was beginning to hush. That night, lamps were flickering, families settling under blankets, and children drifting into sleep. But inside a small rented house, a silent and static storm was gathering. For Susan Nabwire, it had been a normal evening, and that night, she didn't know that the walls that sheltered her were about to betray her. Her husband, the 44-year-old ex-officer, Cyprian Mukoye, had spent the evening filled with suspicion. He accused Susan of infidelity. So he demanded her phone, her passwords, and her M-Pesa PIN. These were not just random demands, but weapons of control in his tightening grip. He slapped her and yelled at her in anger. The house help, a silent witness to everything, froze in the corner, unable to move and breathe. Hours dragged on and anger continued to simmer. Mukoye even refused to eat that night as the tension continued. For everyone in the house, every heartbeat felt like a countdown. Then, at around 3 a.m., time shifted quickly and snapped forward. Mukoye excused himself and claimed that he was going to the bathroom. Moments later, he returned but not unarmed. In his hand, he held an axe, and in a heavy, cold and merciless move, walked towards his wife. Susan begged and pleaded for mercy, even if she had done nothing wrong. But there was no mercy in his eyes that night. The first strike fell on her neck in a vicious, precise and lethal manner. The wall behind them absorbed the blow, and the noise shook the house. Susan collapsed with her scream tearing through the darkness. The 1-year-old child woke up crying as the house help trembled and remained paralyzed by fear. The violence didn't stop there. Mukoye decided to push further into horror. He wrapped a rope around Susan's throat and mouth. And with rising detachment, he gouged her eyes out again and again. While committing this heinous act, he reminded her that he had told her he would finish her as she watched. Grazing her eyes was a cruel act that spoke not only of rage but a message of domination and erasure. Susan finally stopped moving, her body broken and drenched in blood. Her husband tied her and shoved her under the bed, out of sight, but impossible to erase from memory. Yet Mukoye wasn't finished. He turned his attention to the house help, who was at that time terrified, pinned, and cornered. In that house that had once been their home, he carried out the most unspeakable act. He raped her while Susan's child wailed nearby in shock. This was more than a violation, it was a submission and a final act of power. Then, as if completing a twisted ritual, he gathered their phones, locked the door behind them, and vanished into the Nairobi night. Behind him remained a house marred by blood. Inside was a little girl orphaned in moments, a survivor in shock, and a murdered mother hidden from sight. Hours later, police stormed the house. What they found was so brutal that it shook even hardened investigators. Susan's body was retrieved and transferred to Mama Lucy Hospital mortuary. The house help and the child were pulled from the house, still trembling and traumatized. The wreckage of that night was so overwhelming. They were alive but forever marked by what happened. Pipeline had seen violence before. Crimes of desperation, theft, and occasionally utter tragedy. But never had it witnessed something so intimate, so personal. The weapon wasn't a stranger, but a husband, and the crime scene was not a battlefield, but a home. And the devastation wasn't random. It was deliberate, raw, and cruel. This wasn't theft or a wild intrusion. This was betrayal rooted in trust gone wrong. And it was carried out by someone who once wore a badge, a man meant to embody protection, not twisted by violence. On that night, everything safe turned deadly. And when the sun rose over Pipeline Estate, nothing would ever be the same. For 10 long days, Mukoye vanished, a former police officer and a husband, now a fugitive wanted by the police. In Pipeline Estate, whispers filled the narrow alleys. Neighbors replayed the night in hushed voices with rage and anger. They spoke of a man who lived among them, who shared their walls and smiled in daylight. A man who behind closed doors became a monster. But while residents whispered, the police did not. They hunted. Every hour mattered. Investigators combed through phone records and retraced his movements. They also pulled surveillance footage, tagging each thread tighter and pursuing every lead with urgency. This wasn't just another case, this was a very brutal and personal killing that it demanded answers. And on Saturday, August 23, 2025, the chase ended and he was arrested. This was 10 days after Cyprian Mukoye slipped into the night. The same man who once wore the uniform of law and order and pledged to protect, now sat shackled behind bars at Embakasi police station. As headlines broke, there was a collective gasp in Pipeline as the fugitive had been caught. But for Susan's family, the arrest did not mend the wound. Her mother, Phyllis Makoha, faced cameras with trembling hands and hollow eyes. She spoke not in anger but in grief. Grief for a daughter taken too soon and a grandchild who would never know her mother's warmth. A child robbed of lullabies, comfort and guidance all before her second birthday. Neighbors gathered outside their doors. Some mourned openly while others fumed with rage. They weren't only grieving for Susan, but for every woman trapped in silence. They were grieving for every story that ended before it could be told. Because Susan's murder was not an isolated tragedy. It was a mirror. For years, Kenya has battled a rise in gender-based violence, with advocates pointing to poverty, cultural silence, and the shadows of control that grow inside homes. This has been a cycle marred with suspicion, control, abuse, and death. A cycle that has been seen again and again that ends up erupting into horror. And here, it was laid bare in Pipeline. The question hung heavy. If a man trained to defend the public would commit this crime, what about the countless others who hide behind closed doors? Mukoye's arrest did not answer that question. As he sat in his cell, awaiting the slow turn of the court, the city exhaled, but not fully. Because an arrest is often not justice and a trial is never closure. So, no verdict will erase what happened in that small house in Kware, in Pipeline Estate. For Susan's family, justice will never balance the scales, and for her little girl, she will have to endure a life without a mother. And in Pipeline Estate, even after the arrest of Mukoye, the walls of that house still whisper a truth too many already know. Sometimes the greatest danger is not outside, it lives at home with us. The story of Susan Nabwire is more than the tale of a crime. It is the story of trust betrayed, the story of a mother's love stolen too soon, and of a child left behind forever reaching for an embrace that will never return. Her death is a warning. Domestic violence does not always shout. Often, it whispers hidden behind smiles and behind closed doors until silence becomes deadly. For Susan, it was too late. Pipeline Estate will never forget her name. Her family will carry her memory, and perhaps her story will serve as a signal for others to see the danger before the final blow falls. Every statistic has a face, and every case has a name. And every life lost leaves a shadow that lingers across generations. This is not only about one night in Pipeline, it's about a system that fails too many women. It's about rage unchecked, jealousy unhealed, and silence that allows violence to grow. But remembering Susan is an act of defiance. By speaking her name, we remind the world she mattered. This is Dark Our Dogs, and this was the story of Susan. May she rest in peace.